In 1985, the beloved mayor of a quiet West Virginia town vanished without a trace. Now, 23 years later, his son returns home after a shocking discovery. Behind the mayor's old desk wall reveals a rusted revolver, a weathered notebook, and a key that could unlock the truth about his father's murder and the conspiracy that's poisoned the town for decades. Rain pattered softly against the narrow windows of Daniel Bennett's Richmond apartment as he sat hunched at his small kitchen table, the glow from a single desk lamp pooling over the mess of papers in front of him. The edges of the newspaper clippings were curled and brittle, their headlines faded but still legible. Mayor vanishes without a trace, 1985. Search for Thomas Bennett enters second week. He knew every article by heart, yet he still read them as though a new detail might suddenly appear. In the corner of the table sat a battered cigar box, locked with a small brass latch, holding the only surviving pieces of his father's case that he had managed to collect over the years. It had been 23 years since his father walked out of his office one October evening and never came home. Daniel was 16 then, old enough to remember the sound of his mother's voice breaking over the phone when the police called, but too young to understand the quiet shift that overtook the town. People whispered, the local paper speculated, and the official investigation slowly bled away until it was just another cold case file gathering dust. His phone vibrated across the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. The caller ID showed a number from Briar Hollow, a place he had not set foot in for more than a decade. He hesitated before answering. "Mr. Bennett? This is Karen Holt, assistant to Mayor Livingston," a woman's voice said briskly, though there was an edge of hesitation. "We're renovating the old town hall offices, and during work in the mayor's suite, your father's old office, our crew discovered something. We believe it belonged to him." Daniel straightened in his chair. "What kind of something?" There was a pause, as if she was carefully choosing her words. A hidden cavity in the wall behind the desk. Inside was a locked metal box. "It's been turned over to the police, but we thought you should know." For a moment, Daniel could only stare at the rain-streaked window, his mind struggling to catch up. That office had been searched top to bottom in 1985. How could anything have been missed? "I'll be there tomorrow," he said finally, his voice steady though his pulse had begun to pound. After all these years, the past was no longer buried. It had been waiting. The next morning, Daniel's truck rolled off the interstate and onto the two-lane road that wound through the Appalachian foothills toward Briar Hollow. The autumn leaves had begun to turn, flashes of red and gold breaking through the mist that clung to the valleys. He had not driven this way since his mother's funeral, and every mile brought back ghosts of a life he had tried to keep sealed away. The old gas station still stood at the edge of town, though its sign was rusted and half the pumps were gone. The diner where his father used to take him for pancakes on Saturdays now sat boarded up, windows clouded with dust. By the time he pulled into the narrow parking lot behind Town Hall, the air was sharp with the scent of fresh sawdust. Renovation crews moved in and out of the side entrance, their voices echoing through the corridors. Daniel stepped inside and was met by the cool scent of old paper and varnish. A woman in a navy sweater and slacks approached, offering her hand. "Mr. Bennett, I'm Karen Holt. Thank you for coming on such short notice." He nodded, gripping her hand briefly. "I want to see it." She led him down the familiar hallway to his father's old office. The walls were stripped to the studs in places, the air heavy with plaster dust. In the far corner behind where the desk once stood, a square section of paneling had been removed, revealing a dark recess in the wall. On a folding table nearby sat a steel box, its surface dulled with age and mottled with rust. "The workers found it wedged between two support beams," Karen explained quietly. "The police arrived within the hour and opened it here." Daniel stepped closer, his chest tightening as he took in the contents. Resting on a clean evidence cloth was a revolver, the barrel pitted with corrosion and its grip slick with decades-old grime. Beside it lay a worn leather notebook, its cover cracked and edges frayed. A thin brass key, no longer than his thumb, sat apart in its own plastic bag. A detective stood nearby, watching him closely. "Mr. Bennett, We are treating this as potential evidence in your father's disappearance. We will need your cooperation moving forward." Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on the objects. After 23 years, his father's voice felt closer than ever, whispering from the shadows of this room. Something in this box held the truth, and he intended to find it. Detective Mark Ellison introduced himself with a firm handshake and a steady, assessing gaze. He was younger than Daniel expected, early 40s, with the look of someone who had spent years piecing together other people's secrets. He motioned toward the folding table. "The revolver's serial number has been filed down. Forensics will try to recover it, but it's an older model. The leather notebook is more interesting. Most of the pages are blank except for a handful near the back. They're filled with short entries, almost like reminders to himself." Daniel picked up the notebook carefully, the evidence gloves they had given him feeling awkward against the fragile leather. The handwriting was unmistakable. His father's neat, looping script stared back at him from yellowed pages. The entries were brief, but unsettling. "Meeting at Elk Run. Bring copies of water plant plans." Another read, "Illegal shipments continue. Need leverage before they move against me." The final dated note simply said, "Tonight, if I don't come back, it's all in the box." He looked up at Ellison. Why wasn't this found in the original search? Ellison's jaw tightened. The wall was reinforced from behind with an extra layer of paneling. Without knowing exactly where to look, it would have blended into the structure. Whoever put it there intended it to stay hidden for a long time. Daniel's gaze shifted to the brass key. It was worn smooth, the teeth dulled with age. "Any idea what it opens?" "Not yet," Ellison replied. "Could be a safe deposit box? A storage unit? Something smaller. We'll start checking records." Karen had been silent in the corner, her arms crossed, watching the exchange. Now she stepped forward, her voice low. "Your father was under a lot of pressure in those final months. He wouldn't tell me specifics, but I remember him saying he had found something that could change the way people saw this town forever." The weight of her words settled over the room. Daniel set the notebook back down, his fingers lingering on the cracked cover before letting go. The revolver, the key, the notes, none of it felt random. These were breadcrumbs, deliberately left behind. His father had tried to speak across decades, and Daniel could feel the message pressing closer with every breath. Whatever had happened in 1985, it was no accident. And now, the trail was open again. Daniel spent the rest of the afternoon at Town Hall, moving between the stripped-down office and the break room where Ellison had spread out copies of the original case file. The paper smelled faintly of mildew, the edges brittle from years in storage. He recognized some of the photographs from old news coverage, but seeing them in this context felt different. Here was the last known image of his father, taken during a town council meeting the day before he vanished. The mayor looked tired, but his expression carried a flicker of resolve, as if he was bracing for something. Ellison leaned over the table, tapping one of the documents. "These are the statements from 1985. Your mother, the council members, the secretary. Most consistent detail is that your father stayed late to review some kind of building plans. Those plans were never recovered." Daniel thought of the notebook entry. "The water plant." Ellison nodded. "Exactly. At the time, no one could figure out why he needed them. There's no record of a scheduled inspection or repair. If they were tied to illegal activity, it might explain why they disappeared along with him." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a uniformed officer carrying a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a yellowed envelope that had been tucked into the bottom of the steel box, overlooked in the initial search. Ellison slid it open carefully and slid out a single black and white photograph. Daniel's breath caught. It showed his father standing beside two men in heavy coats, the background a rough clearing lined with bare trees. One of the men was half turned away from the camera, but the other's face was sharp and unmistakable even after decades. Ellison glanced at Daniel. "Do you know him?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, but I've seen that face before, in an old news clipping about the coal company." Ellison's expression darkened. That could be a breakthrough. If these men were tied to the company and your father had proof of wrongdoing, it might explain everything. Daniel stared at the photograph again, the image burning into his mind. His father had not been reckless. He had been deliberate, meeting these men for a reason. And whatever that reason was, someone had made sure it would never come to light, until now. By the following morning, the photograph was already on its way to the state lab for enhancement and comparison. Daniel met Ellison outside the courthouse, the air crisp and carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from chimneys scattered across town. They walked together toward a small cafe on Main Street, one of the few places that had not changed in decades. Inside, the walls were lined with framed images of Briar Hollow's history, some of which Daniel remembered seeing as a boy. Over steaming mugs of coffee, Ellison laid out their next steps. I've requested access to the coal company's employment and security records from the early 80s. If that man in the photo worked there, we can find his name. I also want to cross-check the brass key with the banks and storage facilities in the region. It's an unusual cut, which narrows things down. Daniel sipped his coffee, feeling the weight of the conversation settle in his chest. My father knew what he was walking into that night. He wrote about leverage. Whatever he had must have been dangerous enough for someone to kill him over it. Ellison studied him for a moment. You believe he was murdered? I have my whole life, Daniel said quietly. I think my mother did too, even if she never said it out loud. She was afraid. After he disappeared, she stopped talking about him entirely. The bell over the cafe door jingled, and Karen Holt stepped inside, her expression tense. She slid into their booth without waiting for an invitation. I thought you should know, she began, her voice low. A man came by town hall early this morning asking about the box. Said he was a freelance historian, but he had no credentials and wouldn't give a name. When I pressed him, he left. Ellison's eyes narrowed. Description? Karen nodded. Mid-50s, tall gray hair, wearing a brown coat. He didn't seem surprised when I told him the police had the box. More disappointed. Daniel felt a cold unease creep into his gut. Whoever that man was, he knew exactly what had been found. And if he had a reason to want it, then the contents of that hidden wall had already stirred something dangerous awake in Briar Hollow. That afternoon, Daniel found himself standing in front of the Briar Hollow Public Library, a red brick building with creaking wooden steps and tall arched windows. He had spent countless hours here as a teenager, paging through old town records and maps, but this time the purpose was far more urgent. Inside, the familiar scent of paper and polish greeted him. At the reference desk, Mrs. Whitmore, the librarian who had worked there since before he was born, looked up in surprise. Daniel Bennett, she said, adjusting her glasses. It has been a long time. What brings you back? I need access to archived copies of the Briar Hollow Gazette, he replied. Specifically, from 1984 to 1986. I am looking for photographs connected to the coal company and the town's water plant. Her brows rose slightly, but she led him to a back room where a row of microfilm machines sat humming quietly. She left him with a neat stack of reels, and soon he was scrolling through grainy headlines and faded photographs. Flood repairs, council disputes, industrial accidents. Then, halfway through the 1985 files, a front-page image caught his eye. It was the same man from the hidden photograph, only this time his name was printed beneath the picture, Richard Harlan, former operations manager for Briar Hollow Coal and Processing. The article was about a temporary suspension following allegations of illegal dumping, though no charges were filed. The date was 3 months before his father disappeared. Daniel printed the page and slipped it into a folder. As he was packing up, a movement outside the library's front window caught his attention. A man in a brown coat stood across the street, leaning casually against a lamppost, his gaze fixed on the library entrance. Mid-50s. Gray hair. The description Karen had given. Daniel pretended to return to his work, watching from the corner of his eye. The man stayed for several minutes before stepping away and vanishing into the crowd near the corner store. Daniel's pulse quickened. This was no coincidence. Someone was watching, keeping track of every step he took. When he left the library, the street looked ordinary again, but the sense of being followed clung to him like a shadow. Whatever trail his father had left was not only still visible after 23 years, it was attracting attention from people who clearly wanted it buried. That evening, Daniel sat in the small motel room he had rented on the edge of town, the hum of the old heater filling the silence. He spread the day's findings across the bed, the printed newspaper page with Richard Harlan's name at the center. Ellison had called earlier to confirm that the state lab was enhancing the hidden photograph, and initial matches suggested Harlan was indeed one of the men with his father in that wooded clearing. The question now was why? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Daniel crossed the room and peered through the peephole. Ellison stood outside, his coat collar turned up against the night wind. Daniel let him in, and the detective wasted no time. "We ran the brass key through the state's locksmith database," Ellison said, pulling a folded printout from his pocket. "It belongs to a safety deposit box registered at First Mountain Bank. That branch closed in 1992, but its contents were transferred to the state archives in Charleston. If your father put something in there, it might still be waiting." Daniel felt a spark of cautious hope. "How soon can we get access?" "I've already filed for a court order," Ellison replied. "But I need to warn you when I made the request. Someone else had already inquired about the box last month. No name given, just a legal proxy. That means someone else knows it exists." Daniel's thoughts went to the man in the brown coat. "I think I've seen him. Across from the library this afternoon." Ellison's eyes narrowed. "Then we need to move fast. If your father left evidence, it could be enough to reopen not just his case, but a dozen others tied to the coal company. That makes it dangerous for anyone holding it." The heater clicked off, leaving the room in a heavy quiet. Daniel looked down at the folder on the bed, the face of Richard Harlan staring back at him from decades ago. Somewhere between his father's office, that photograph, and the key lay the truth of what happened in 1985. And now, it seemed, the people who had buried it were starting to circle again. The following morning was damp and gray, low clouds pressing against the rooftops of Briar Hollow as Daniel drove to the police station. Ellison had called early, asking him to come in. Inside, the detective's office was cluttered with maps, file boxes, and a scattering of coffee-stained notes. A manila envelope lay in the center of his desk. "We got the enhancement back on that photograph," Ellison said, sliding it across. Daniel opened it and found a sharper version of the image taken from behind the wall. The details were startling now. His father stood with Richard Harlan, and beside them was another man Daniel had never seen before. This man's face was narrow, his eyes sharp, and his suit too fine for the muddy clearing they stood in. Ellison tapped the edge of the picture. "That's Charles Emery," he explained. "He was a councilman in the mid-'80s, served on the development board. No criminal record, but his name shows up in state environmental reports tied to questionable land sales." Daniel studied the image. The three men were not posing. They looked caught in a moment, mid-conversation, tension evident in the way his father's hands were tucked into his coat pockets. Ellison leaned back in his chair. If your father had documentation linking Emery and Harlan to illegal dumping, that would explain the risk. It could also explain why he never came home. Before Daniel could answer, a knock sounded at the door. An officer stepped in, holding a small evidence bag. Inside was a folded slip of paper, creased and yellowed with age. "This was turned in by a woman cleaning out her late father's garage," the officer said. "She found it in an old tool chest. Her father worked maintenance at the coal company." And a plash. Ellison opened the bag and unfolded the paper. Scrawled in hurried handwriting was a short note. "Meeting confirmed. Mayor knows too much. Remove him before Elk Run deal closes." Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. There it was, the blunt confirmation of what he had always feared. Ellison's eyes met his, steady but grim. "We are no longer just talking about a disappearance. This is murder, and it looks like the people responsible are still close enough to watch what we do next." By late afternoon, Daniel and Ellison were on the road, the cruiser's tires humming against the wet asphalt as they headed toward the outskirts of town. The address they were aiming for belonged to a small farmhouse once owned by a retired coal company foreman who had died the previous year. His daughter, the woman who had turned in the note, had agreed to meet them there before the place was cleared out. The house sat at the end of a gravel drive lined with bare maple trees, paint peeled from the siding, and the porch sagged slightly under its own weight. Inside, the air smelled faintly of oil and mildew. Cardboard boxes were stacked against the walls, and a single floor lamp cast a dim circle of light in the living room where she waited. "I don't know if what I found means anything," she began, her voice soft. "My father never spoke about the company's business, but he was always nervous when your dad's name came up." She gestured toward a low wooden cabinet. "There's more in there if you want to look." Daniel knelt and opened the cabinet doors. Inside were 3 dusty binders, their covers warped with age. He pulled one free and flipped it open. Pages of handwritten logs, detailed equipment shipments, maintenance schedules, and a surprising number of late-night deliveries to the water treatment plant. Many were signed off by Richard Harlan himself. Ellison leaned over his shoulder. "These are detailed enough to establish a pattern. If those deliveries contained hazardous materials, your father may have had all the proof he needed." Daniel's fingers paused on a page dated just a week before his father disappeared. It listed Elk Run, final load before acquisition, followed by a string of numbers and initials. The handwriting matched the note from the tool chest. The woman watched them quietly, arms folded. "If there's danger in keeping those, you should take them now. I don't want any part of it." They carried the binders out to the car, the weight of them more than just paper and ink. As they drove back toward town, Daniel stared out at the darkening fields. Every new piece of evidence pulled the past into sharper focus, but it also pushed them closer to the people who had killed his father. And those people, he knew, were already watching. Night had fallen by the time they returned to the station. The rain had picked up, drumming steadily against the windows as Ellison spread the 3 binders across his desk. A yellow desk lamp cast long shadows over the pages while the overhead lights remained off, the room feeling more like a quiet war room than a police office. Daniel sat opposite, flipping carefully through one of the logs. The handwriting varied, but the same names kept surfacing: Harlan, Emery, and a handful of others Daniel did not recognize. Ellison had already begun cross-referencing the shipment dates with public records. "Look at this," he said, turning the monitor toward Daniel. "On the nights these deliveries were made, the water plant's security system shows unexplained outages. No recorded footage, no alarms. That's not an accident." Daniel leaned in, his pulse quickening. "So they were shutting down the cameras while dumping whatever they were bringing in." "That's what it looks like," Ellison replied. "And if your father had access to these logs, he would have known exactly when and how they were doing it." The low murmur of the rain was broken by the distant sound of a phone ringing at the front desk. Moments later, an officer appeared in the doorway, his expression unsettled. "Detective, there's a situation you should know about. A vehicle was spotted parked across from Mr. Bennett's motel for over an hour. By the time a patrol car approached, it took off." Daniel felt the cold grip of recognition. "Brown coat, gray hair?" The officer hesitated, then nodded. "That's what the witness said." Ellison stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "We're moving you out of that motel. It's too exposed. If someone is monitoring us this closely, they know we have something worth protecting." Daniel followed him into the hall, the weight of the binders heavy in his hands. The evidence felt less like paper now and more like a live wire, carrying the dangerous energy of whatever truth his father had uncovered. As they stepped out into the wet night, Daniel glanced at the dark street beyond the lot. Somewhere out there, the same eyes that had been watching his father 23 years ago were now fixed on him. The difference was that this time he intended to see them coming. The safe house was a rented cabin on the edge of Briar Hollow, tucked deep among pines that swayed in the damp night air. Ellison had arranged it through a trusted friend, and by the time they arrived, the rain had tapered to a mist, leaving the road slick and gleaming in the headlights. Inside, the single-room space was modest but secure, with heavy curtains over the windows and only one way in or out. Daniel set the binders on the small kitchen table, the smell of wet earth still clinging to his clothes. Ellison locked the door behind them and began unpacking his own files, spreading maps and photographs beside the coal company records. "We have to treat this like they're already 2 steps ahead," he said quietly. "If they know where you were staying, they may know what we found in those binders." Daniel leaned over the pages, tracing the shipment routes with his finger. "The Elk Run reference shows up here too," he said, tapping an entry dated 2 days before his father vanished. "Same initials, same numbers." Ellison nodded. "That's the missing piece. The Elk Run site was supposed to be sold off to a private developer, but there were rumors it was being used as a dumping ground even after the mine shut down. If your father planned to expose that, it could have been the final straw." A log in the second binder caught Daniel's eye. The handwriting was tighter, more deliberate than the others. It listed a meeting between Harlan, Emery, and an unidentified third man at the water plant the night before the mayor disappeared. In the margin, someone had written in faint pencil, "Mayor aware, move quick." The cabin felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Daniel closed the binder and looked toward the drawn curtains. He must have known they were closing in on him. Ellison watched him for a long moment before speaking. "And now they know you're digging. We need to get to Elk Run before they realize how close we are." Outside, the wind stirred the trees, carrying the faint rustle of needles against glass. Somewhere beyond the dark line of the forest lay the place where his father's trail had gone cold, and where Daniel suspected it might finally grow warm again. Morning brought a pale fog that hung low over the pines, the damp air seeping into the cabin. Daniel barely slept, his mind cycling through the notes in the binders and the faces from the photograph. Ellison had been up even earlier, already on the phone when Daniel emerged from the small bedroom. The detective ended the call and poured coffee into 2 mugs. "I pulled some strings," he said, sliding one toward Daniel. "We've got clearance to access the Elk Run site today. It's technically private property now, but the State Environmental Office is sending an inspector to make it official. We'll have a few hours before the owner even hears about it." The drive out was quiet, the road narrowing as they left the paved highway for a cracked strip of asphalt winding through dense forest. The farther they went, the more the landscape seemed abandoned by time. Rusted equipment lay half buried in weeds, and the skeletal remains of conveyor towers loomed against the gray sky. They parked beside a chain-link gate, its padlock already cut by the inspector, who greeted them with a curt nod. Beyond the fence, the old mine yard stretched out in a bleak sprawl of mud and gravel, punctuated by the yawning black mouth of the Elk Run shaft. Daniel followed Ellison across the yard toward a collapsed storage shed marked on the shipment logs. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic tang of rust. Broken crates and dented barrels were scattered across the dirt floor, some with faded hazard symbols barely visible beneath grime. The inspector crouched beside one, brushing away dirt to reveal a serial number that matched the logs. "This is it," Ellison murmured. "These barrels were never supposed to be here. If your father knew, it ties everything together." Daniel moved deeper into the shed, his flashlight beam catching on something half buried near the back wall. He knelt and dug through the dirt until his fingers closed around a fragment of fabric dark wool, frayed and stiff with age. A button still clung to it, engraved with the seal of Briar Hollow. He held it up, the breath catching in his chest. It had come from a mayor's jacket. Ellison's voice was low, steady. "Daniel, this might be the first physical trace of your father in 23 years. Daniel turned the fragment over in his hands, the coarse wool leaving a faint residue of soil on his fingertips. The engraving on the button was worn, but the seal of Briar Hollow was still visible under the grime. It was a design he had seen countless times on the ceremonial jackets his father wore to official events. The weight of it in his palm felt heavier than it should, as though it carried the years between that October night and this moment. Ellison signaled for the inspector, who knelt to examine the find. "If this was buried here for over 2 decades, it means someone wanted it hidden," the inspector said quietly. He pulled a small evidence bag from his kit, and Daniel hesitated only a moment before placing the fragment inside. They continued their search, moving to the far end of the shed where the walls were beginning to buckle inward. Here, the dirt floor was uneven, and a patch near the corner looked recently disturbed. Ellison crouched down, running his fingers through the loose soil. "This isn't from animals," he said. "Someone dug here and not long ago." The 3 of them worked carefully, pulling back layers of earth until the edge of a metal box emerged. It was small, dented, and sealed tight with a rusted latch. Ellison set it aside for processing, unwilling to risk breaking it open without proper tools. Daniel stepped back, scanning the dim interior of the shed. The air felt heavy, charged with the sense that they were standing in a place where something irreversible had happened. Every creak of the collapsing structure seemed to echo too loudly. When they emerged into the gray daylight, the inspector took the fabric fragment and the sealed box to his vehicle. Ellison lingered by the gate, his gaze fixed on the tree line that surrounded the property. "Someone's been here before us," he said. "Whoever disturbed that soil might have been looking for the same thing we are. And, if they came up empty, they'll know we didn't." Daniel followed his eyes toward the woods, half expecting to see movement between the trunks. The silence was unbroken, but it carried a warning. If this place held the truth about his father, they were not the only ones trying to claim it. The drive back from Elk Run was tense, the road slick with drizzle, and the woods pressing close on either side. Daniel kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half convinced a set of headlights would appear and follow them all the way to town. Ellison was quiet in the passenger seat, his focus somewhere far beyond the wet blur of the windshield. The evidence they had recovered sat locked in the trunk, the fragment of the mayor's jacket and the rusted metal box sealed in separate bags. When they reached the station, Ellison wasted no time securing the items in the evidence room. "We'll get the box opened under controlled conditions," he said. "If it's been sealed since the 80s, whatever's inside could be fragile. Or dangerous." Daniel nodded, but his attention kept drifting to the thought of someone else having been at the shed recently. The disturbed soil, the subtle signs of intrusion, it meant the past had not been left alone. Whoever was searching had a purpose, and Daniel doubted it was to hand over the truth. Later that evening, he walked down Main Street, the mist softening the glow of the street lamps. The old storefronts looked the same as they had in his childhood. But the town felt different now, shadowed by the knowledge of what had been happening beneath its surface for decades. He paused outside the diner where his father used to take him on Saturday mornings. Through the glass, he saw Karen Holt in a corner booth, a cup of coffee in front of her. She waved him in, and he slid into the seat opposite her. "I heard you were out at Elk Run," she said quietly. "People are already talking. You know how this town is. Rumors move faster than truth." Daniel studied her face, trying to read what lay beneath her calm tone. "Then you know why I'm here. My father left pieces of something behind, and I think we're getting close to seeing the whole picture." Karen's gaze flicked toward the window, as if making sure no one was listening. "Be careful, Daniel. When people like Harlan and Emery feel the walls closing in, they don't fight fair. They never have." The words stayed with him as he left the diner, the mist curling along the empty street. Somewhere out there, the same danger that had swallowed his father was still awake, and it was watching. The next morning, Daniel was at the station before sunrise. The air outside was crisp, the kind that hinted at the first touch of autumn, and the streets were still empty, except for the occasional delivery truck rumbling past. Inside, the hum of fluorescent lights filled the quiet halls. Ellison was already in the evidence room with a pair of gloves and a small set of tools laid out on the table. The rusted metal box from Elk Run sat in the center, its latch still locked tight. "State Labs signed off on opening it here," Ellison said, sliding on the gloves. "If there's anything inside, we'll document it immediately." End quote. Daniel watched as he worked the latch with slow, deliberate movements. The metal resisted at first, creaking like it had been holding its breath for decades. Finally, with a reluctant snap, it gave way. Ellison eased the lid open. Inside was a stack of folded papers, their edges browned with age, and a small black cassette tape with no label. The papers were brittle, but legible. Handwritten notes in his father's familiar script detailed meetings with Harlan, Emery, and unnamed out-of-town associates. Dates and locations matched entries from the coal company logs. One page included a crude map of the Elk Run site with several areas circled, each marked with a single word, burial. Daniel's chest tightened as he read. These were not vague suspicions. This was direct evidence that his father had documented illegal dumping and was preparing to present it. The final page was different. The writing was hurried, smudged, as if done in haste. It read, "If something happens to me, give this to Karen Holt." Ellison lifted the cassette from the box. "We'll need to find a player. If it's an audio recording, it could be a statement your father never got to make." Before Daniel could respond, the desk phone in the corner rang sharply, cutting through the stillness. Ellison answered, his face darkening as he listened. "That was patrol," he said when he hung up. "Karen's office was broken into last night. Nothing taken, but the lock was forced." Daniel felt a slow chill spread through him. The message in the box had been clear, and someone else might already know it was meant for her. The walls around the truth were closing in, and the time to act was slipping away. Daniel found Karen at the diner just after it opened, the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon clinging to the air. She was at her usual corner booth, a stack of papers spread in front of her, though her eyes were distant, fixed on the condensation sliding down her coffee mug. When he slid into the seat across from her, she looked up with a tired smile that did little to hide her unease. "I heard about your office," he said. "Ellison thinks it wasn't just a random break-in." Karen's expression hardened. "It wasn't. They didn't take anything because they couldn't find what they were looking for." She lowered her voice. "Your father trusted me with things back then. I've kept them safe, but I always knew someone might come looking." Daniel reached into his bag and set the folded note from the metal box on the table. Her eyes moved over the words, and for a moment her composure slipped. "He wrote this?" she asked. "He did. And there's more. We found records, a map, and a cassette tape. I think he meant for you to have all of it." Karen leaned back, her gaze drifting to the window. "Your father was going to bring it to me the night he vanished. We were supposed to meet at the library after hours. He never showed. The next morning they said he'd gone missing." The clatter of dishes and low hum of conversation around them felt far away. Daniel waited, sensing there was more she had not said. Finally, she met his eyes. "I think I know why the tape is important. There was a man from Charleston, a state investigator. He suspected Harlan and Emery were bribing officials to ignore the dumping. If your father recorded a statement for him, it could connect everything: money, illegal waste, and the cover-up." Daniel's mind turned to the break-in. "Then someone else knows the tape exists." Karen nodded. "And if they didn't find it in my office, they'll come looking for you next." A waitress passed by, refilling their mugs. The warmth of the coffee was a poor counter to the cold weight settling in Daniel's chest. They were no longer chasing the truth in the shadows. The truth was out in the open now, and so was the danger. Ellison managed to track down an old cassette player from the evidence storage, a bulky silver model with worn buttons and a faint smell of dust and oil. They set it up in the small conference room at the station, the blinds drawn tight and the door locked. Daniel sat across from him, the black cassette resting on the table between them like a fragile artifact from another lifetime. Ellison picked it up, slid it into the player, and pressed play. For a moment, there was only the low hiss of static. Then his father's voice filled the room, older in tone than Daniel remembered, but steady. "If you are hearing this," it began, "it means I did not make it to the meeting. My name is Thomas Bennett, mayor of Briar Hollow, and I have evidence that members of the council, including Richard Harlan and Charles Emery, are involved in an ongoing scheme to dispose of industrial waste illegally at Elk Run and surrounding properties. Daniel leaned forward, his chest tight. The voice continued, outlining dates, payments, and locations in precise detail, matching much of what they had already uncovered in the binders. But then came something new. I have reason to believe they intend to silence anyone who threatens to expose them. I have been followed for days. If I disappear, it was not by choice. The tape clicked as his father paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a faint tremor. To my son, Daniel, trust Karen Holt. She knows what to do. And to those responsible, know this: the truth will surface, even if I do not. When the recording ended, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the player's motor. Ellison reached forward and pressed stop. "This is enough to reopen the case," he said quietly, "and maybe enough to bring them down." Daniel stared at the player, the sound of his father's voice still echoing in his head. It was the closest he had been to him in 23 years, and it brought both a fierce resolve and a sharp ache he could not swallow down. Outside the room, the station hallway was quiet, but Daniel knew the quiet would not last. Once they moved with this evidence, the men who had killed his father would know they were cornered. And cornered men were dangerous. Ellison wasted no time making copies of the tape, sealing one for the state investigator's office and locking another in the station's evidence vault. The original went into a secure case, the kind used for transporting high-priority evidence. "We need to move fast," he said, glancing toward the frosted glass of the conference room door. "Once this reaches the right people, it will be harder for them to bury it." Daniel followed him out into the gray morning, the clouds hanging low over Briar Hollow. They loaded into Ellison's unmarked sedan, taking a back route toward Charleston. The air inside the car was heavy with unspoken tension, the kind that settled in when both men understood they were carrying something that could change everything and put them in serious danger. About 20 miles out, Ellison's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. "We've got a tail," he said, his tone calm but clipped. Daniel turned just enough to catch the shape of a dark SUV, its headlights steady, hanging back at a careful distance. Ellison took the next exit without signaling, winding through a narrow road flanked by dense woods. The SUV followed. Daniel's pulse thudded in his ears. "They know about the tape," he said. "They knew before we even pressed play," Ellison replied. "Which means we're dealing with someone feeding them information from inside." The road curved sharply, and Ellison cut the headlights for a moment, coasting onto a gravel turnout hidden behind a wall of trees. The SUV passed by a few seconds later, its taillights glowing faintly through the mist before vanishing into the curve ahead. They waited in silence until the sound of the engine faded completely. Ellison started the car again, keeping his speed low. "We're not going straight to Charleston now. Too risky. We'll make a copy drop at a safe location first." Daniel nodded, but his eyes stayed on the trees. The sense of being hunted clung to him like the damp air. Whoever was protecting Harlan and Emery had reach, patience, and no hesitation about stepping out of the shadows. As they rejoined the highway miles later, Daniel tightened his grip on the seat. The evidence was their only shield now, and as long as they held it, the men who had killed his father would be closing in. By late afternoon, the sky had deepened to a bruised shade of gray, the first drops of rain streaking the windshield as Ellison pulled into a rundown storage facility on the outskirts of a neighboring county. The rows of corrugated metal units stretched into the distance, their padlocks dull with rust. It was the kind of place where things could be hidden in plain sight, forgotten by anyone who wasn't meant to remember. Ellison parked near the farthest row and cut the engine. "A friend of mine uses one of these units for off-the-books evidence storage. No one outside of a tight circle even knows it exists." He retrieved the secure case from the back seat and led Daniel down the row to a blue unit with a scuffed door. Inside, the space was dim and cool, the smell of dust and motor oil hanging in the air. Metal shelves lined the walls, stacked with unmarked boxes and sealed envelopes. Ellison placed the case, containing the original tape, high on a shelf, behind a stack of binders. "If something happens to us, there's a list in my desk that will lead the right people here," he said, locking the unit again. They were halfway back to the car when the sharp crunch of gravel made them both stop. A black sedan had pulled in through the front gate, its tinted windows reflecting the low light. It rolled slowly down the main lane between the storage rows, not quite blocking their path, but close enough to make a point. Ellison's voice was low. "Keep walking. Don't look like we're in a hurry." Daniel forced himself to match Ellison's pace, his eyes fixed ahead. He could feel the weight of whoever was inside the sedan watching them. When they reached the car, Ellison unlocked it quickly, sliding behind the wheel. The black sedan idled a few moments longer, then turned sharply and headed back toward the gate. As they pulled out in the opposite direction, Daniel finally spoke. "They're letting us know they're close." Ellison nodded. "And that they're not afraid to follow us into the open." The rain picked up, tapping against the roof in a steady rhythm. Daniel looked out at the wet road ahead, knowing the game had shifted. The tape was safe for now, but they had just told their enemies exactly how far they were willing to go to protect it. Night had settled over Briar Hollow by the time Daniel returned to his apartment. The rain had followed him all the way back, now reduced to a fine drizzle that clung to the air and dampened the streets. The hallway outside his door smelled faintly of damp carpet and old paint, and the building was quiet, except for the distant hum of a television in another unit. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, immediately sensing something was wrong. The living room lights, which he had left off that morning, were on. A faint draft brushed past his legs from the slightly open kitchen window. His chest tightened. He crossed the room quickly, scanning for anything out of place. A drawer in his desk was pulled halfway open, papers scattered across the floor. Daniel moved toward the bedroom, his pulse loud in his ears. Nothing was missing that he could see, but someone had searched with precision, rifling through files, pulling open closets, leaving just enough disarray to send a message. Whoever it was had not been looking for valuables, they had been looking for the tape. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him freeze. They stopped outside his door. A slow knock followed, deliberate and measured. Daniel stood still, listening. The knock came again, then silence. He moved to the peephole, but the corridor was empty. He waited several minutes before locking the window and double-checking the door. His first instinct was to call Ellison, but he stopped himself. If someone had tapped their phones or planted a listening device, alerting him now could put them both in more danger. Instead, Daniel pulled the blinds shut and sat at the kitchen table, forcing himself to breathe evenly. The apartment felt smaller, its familiar corners shadowed with unease. The intrusion was not just a warning, it was proof that they could reach him at any time. The original tape might be hidden away, but the copies, the notes, even his own life were now exposed pieces in the game. Outside, a car engine started, the sound fading into the distance. Daniel stayed at the table long after it was gone, knowing that this was no longer about uncovering his father's truth in the safety of daylight. The fight had crossed the threshold into his own home, and it would not stop there. Daniel did not sleep that night. Every creak in the building, every groan of the pipes sent him glancing toward the door. By dawn, he had made up his mind. He left the apartment quietly, keeping to side streets as he made his way to the station. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and pine. Ellison was already at his desk, a half-empty coffee mug beside him. He looked up sharply when Daniel walked in. "You look like you haven't been home," he said. "I was home," Daniel replied. "Someone else was, too." Ellison set down his pen, his expression tightening. "They didn't take anything?" "Not that I could tell. They were looking, though, for the tape or something connected to it." Ellison rubbed his jaw, thinking, "Then we have to assume they know about the copies. And if they know about the copies, they might try to intercept us before we can get them to Charleston." Daniel leaned closer. "Then we move before they can. No more waiting." Ellison nodded slowly. "We take one copy to Charleston ourselves today, but we split the trip, one car, 2 drivers, and someone on the inside who doesn't know exactly where we're going. That way, if they're listening, they'll be chasing ghosts." They spent the morning preparing, sealing the copy of the tape in a padded envelope and disguising it among unrelated case files. Daniel kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see the dark SUV idling outside. Just before noon, Ellison's phone buzzed. He checked it, then looked at Daniel. "Karen, she says someone's been following her since last night. 2 different cars, both with out-of-state plates." The decision was immediate. "Then she comes with us," Daniel said. "If they're watching her, it might give us the cover we need." By the time they pulled out of Briar Hollow, Karen was in the back seat, her eyes scanning the road behind them. Daniel drove while Ellison kept watch. The town shrank in the rearview mirror, but the sense of being hunted did not. Somewhere out there, Daniel knew, the men responsible for his father's death were tightening their net. And if they wanted to stop the truth from reaching daylight, this might be their last chance to do it. The highway stretched ahead in a ribbon of pale asphalt, cutting through miles of rolling hills and dense forest. The air inside the car was taut, each of them tuned to the rhythm of the tires against the road, listening for anything that didn't belong. Karen sat forward in the back seat, her gaze fixed on the side mirror. "Gray pickup," she said quietly. "It's been behind us since we left town." Ellison glanced back, then at Daniel. "Not the same as before, could be nothing, but we don't take chances." Daniel kept his speed steady, resisting the urge to push the gas. The last thing they needed was to spook whoever was trailing them into making a move they weren't ready for. The rain from the night before had left the roads slick, the sun struggling to burn through a heavy layer of mist. Ellison unfolded a paper map across his lap, tracing a finger along a thin, unmarked road. 2 miles ahead, there's a service turnoff for an old ranger station. If we take it, we'll see if they follow. When the turn appeared, Daniel flicked on the blinker and eased off the main highway. The gravel road narrowed quickly, branches arching overhead until they were swallowed in green. In the mirror, the gray pickup made the turn too. Karen's hand tightened around the back of Daniel's seat. "They're not just curious." And if the ranger station came into view, its roof sagging, windows boarded over. Daniel pulled in and stopped, his hand resting lightly on the gear shift. The pickup rolled to a slow halt about 50 yards back, its engine idling low. No one got out. Ellison pushed open his door, stepping onto the gravel with a deliberate slowness. He raised a hand in a half-wave, as if to signal there was nothing to hide. The pickup stayed where it was. After a long moment, it backed up, tires crunching over the loose rock, and disappeared the way it had come. Ellison climbed back in, shutting the door firmly. "They were making sure we knew they were there. That's a message." Daniel steered them back toward the highway, the trees closing in again on either side. The envelope with the tape sat wedged between the seat and console, its presence a constant reminder. Every mile they drove brought them closer to Charleston, but it also stripped away any doubt. The hunt had become open, and there would be no turning back. Charleston's skyline emerged through the haze just as the afternoon light began to fade, the taller buildings casting long shadows over the harbor. Daniel felt a flicker of relief at seeing the city, but it was tempered by the weight of what they carried and the knowledge that the men who wanted it stopped would not simply fade away. Ellison directed him through a tangle of downtown streets until they reached a narrow alley between 2 brick warehouses. He told Daniel to park behind a row of dented dumpsters, the smell of salt water and oil thick in the air. Karen stayed in the car, her eyes scanning the mouth of the alley. A tall man in a dark overcoat emerged from a side door, moving with the kind of deliberate calm that suggested he had been expecting them. Ellison stepped out to greet him, shaking his hand before pulling the padded envelope from his jacket. No names were exchanged, only a quiet acknowledgement of purpose. Daniel watched as Ellison handed the tape over. The man slid it inside an inner pocket, gave a short nod, and disappeared back through the door without a word. It was over in less than 30 seconds, but Daniel felt the air shift. The weight they had been carrying for days was now in someone else's hands, yet it brought no sense of safety, only the reality that the danger had not ended. On the drive out of the city, traffic pressed close on all sides, the muted roar of engines filling the car. Daniel kept checking the mirrors, half expecting the gray pickup or the black sedan to appear. But there was nothing, only the steady stream of commuters heading home. Karen broke the silence first. If the tape makes it into the right hands, it's not just the councilmen who are in trouble. This will pull down everyone tied to Elk Run. Daniel gripped the wheel a little tighter. Then they'll have nothing left to lose. Ellison didn't answer, but his eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead. The city lights faded behind them, swallowed by the darkening sky. Whatever came next would no longer be about holding on to evidence. It would be about surviving long enough to see the truth come to light. The road back to Briar Hollow wound through miles of dark forest, the only light coming from the car's headlights cutting a narrow path ahead. The rain had returned, tapping against the windshield in uneven bursts. Daniel drove in silence, his mind replaying the image of the man in the overcoat slipping away with the tape. The relief of handing it off had quickly given way to an uneasy emptiness, like passing a torch in a race that was far from finished. Ellison dozed lightly in the passenger seat, his head tilted against the window, but Karen stayed awake in the back, her eyes following the rain trails across the glass. "You think it's safe now?" she asked quietly. Daniel hesitated. "Safe for the tape, maybe? Not for us." They were less than an hour from town when the faint glow of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. At first, Daniel thought it was just another car on the lonely stretch of highway, but the lights stayed fixed, holding the same distance through every curve. Ellison stirred and glanced behind them. "That's not random," he said, his voice low. Daniel's pulse picked up. He eased the car a little faster, testing the other driver. The headlights matched him, neither gaining nor falling back. The rain-slicked pavement and narrow shoulders left few options. "Next turn," Ellison said, pointing to a gravel side road up ahead. "Let's see how committed they are." Daniel took it without signaling, the tires crunching loudly over the wet gravel. The road narrowed quickly, tree branches brushing against the car. Behind them, the headlights followed. Karen leaned forward. "It's them." The road ended abruptly at a chain-link gate. Daniel swung the wheel hard, turning the car to face back the way they'd come. The other vehicle slowed as it approached. Its shape now visible in the dim light, a black sedan, the same one from the storage facility. For a long moment, the two vehicles sat facing each other, engines idling, the rain hissing on metal. Then the sedan backed up slowly, retreating into the dark without a word or gesture. Ellison exhaled. "They're not done with us. They're just letting us know they can find us anywhere." Daniel pulled back onto the highway, the wipers beating a steady rhythm. The game was no longer about the tape, it was about surviving the final move. Dawn broke over Briar Hollow in a pale wash of gold, the kind of soft light that made the town look almost untouched by the shadows that had lingered for decades. Daniel stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, the chill of the stone beneath his palms grounding him as he watched people gather in the square. News had traveled fast. Word had come late the night before that the tape had reached the state attorney's office. Warrants had been signed before midnight. By sunrise, officers were moving in on Richard Harlan, Charles Emery, and 3 others tied to the Elk Run scheme. Daniel had watched the arrests from a distance, the sight stirring a strange mix of triumph and grief. Justice was finally moving, but it had taken 23 years and the loss of his father to get here. Ellison joined him on the steps, his coat collar turned up against the cold. "It's done," he said. "They'll face trial, and with what's on that tape, it won't be a short one." Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the old mayor's office across the street. Behind those walls, his father had fought a quiet battle, one that had cost him everything. Now, with the truth finally in the open, the building looked different, not like the scene of a disappearance, but a monument to what had been endured. Karen approached from the crowd, her expression softening as she reached them. "Your father would have been proud," she said. Daniel managed a faint smile. "I just wish he could have seen it." For a moment, they stood together in the crisp morning air, the square buzzing with murmured conversations and the occasional flash of a camera. It felt like the whole town was waking from a long sleep. As the sun climbed higher, Daniel took one last look at the courthouse and the faces in the crowd. The danger was over for now, but the scars of what had happened would not fade quickly. Still, the weight in his chest had lightened. The truth had survived the dark, and so had he. When they finally turned to leave, the streets of Briar Hollow stretched ahead, glistening with the promise of a day no longer haunted by the silence of 1985.